You can use the XML layout to translate log4net events into XML elements. The XML layout supports the following properties. Base64 encode message and base64 encode properties do similar things. You can set either of these properties to true to encode the relevant part of the log event as a base64 string. This can be useful if your log events contain binary data or data that can't be represented as XML. You can use the prefix property to define the namespace prefix used for the element names in the XML. The value of the prefix property defaults to the string log4net. The invalid char replacement property is a string that log4net uses to represent invalid XML characters inside of the XML element it generates from the log event. By default, this property value is simply a question mark. You can learn more about which characters can't be represented as valid XML at the URL on your screen. Finally, the XML layout supports the location info property. If you set this property to true, the layout will include code-level location information inside of each XML element, representing the location in code where that event was raised. The logging configuration for a simple application is now back to using a console appender. This console appender has been reconfigured to use the XML layout. When the program executes, you'll notice that the logging output has changed from the semi-organized text into this hot mess of XML. As messy as this looks on the console, it's actually quite structured. Let's break out one of these elements so I can show you exactly what you're looking at. Each log event will be translated by the XML layout into an event XML element. Each attribute on this element represents one of the properties from the log event that was raised. These include the name of the logger that generated the event, the timestamp of the event, the severity level, the thread name or identifier on which the event was raised, the name of the app domain, and the identity of the user that's running the application that generated the logging event. The event element contains a child message element, which represents the formatted log object or message that was passed in to the log event. In addition, there's a child properties element that includes all of the contextual properties that are available on the logging event. We'll discuss log context in greater detail in a later module of this course. The XML layout doesn't allow you to configure which of these properties get represented in XML and which don't. And this is unfortunate because by default, the XML layout includes a very expensive property. This username attribute contains the identity of the user that is running the application which generated the log event. This is not a cheap piece of information to obtain, and unfortunately, the XML layout will obtain it every time a logging event is raised in your application. So, the XML layout produces one XML element for every log event that your application produces. However, there's two aspects to this XML output that you need to be aware of in order to process it correctly. First, the stream of XML elements produced by the XML layout doesn't constitute a well-formed XML document. While each of these event elements are perfectly valid, they're orphaned outside of a containing document element. The second aspect of this output that you'll need to be aware of is that log4net automatically prepends the name of the event element with a log4net namespace prefix. However, it never associates this namespace prefix with an appropriate XML namespace. Whatever tooling you end up using to process this XML output will need to be able to cope with the fact that the output is an XML fragment and not a complete document. In addition, your tooling will likely need to associate the log4net namespace prefix with an XML namespace. There are plenty of ways to go about doing this. For this first demonstration, I'm going to show you how the log4net documentation suggests that you compensate for this XML fragment. I've modified the logging configuration for the application to produce a log.xml file using the file appender. When I run the application, the log.xml file is created on the file system. However, when I look at its contents, you can see that it just contains the XML document fragment I mentioned earlier. The Log4Net documentation suggests that you create a containing XML document that references the document type definition that ships with the Log4Net framework. That's what I've done here. I've created this file named lookatmylog.xml that pulls in the document type definition included with the Log4Net distribution. The document type definition for this XML file also defines a system entity named data that pulls in the log.xml generated by my application. This containing XML document defines a root element named events that also associates the Log4Net namespace prefix with the official Log4Net namespace controlled by apache.org. Inside of the container events element, I reference the data entity, which pulls in the contents of log.xml. The net effect of all this is that the individual event elements inside of the log.xml file become child elements inside of the lookatmylog.xml file. I can then reference the containing XML document using any of my favorite XML viewers, such as PowerShell. This example uses the PowerShell XML type accelerator to translate the content of lookatmylog.xml into an XML document. Once the XML has been loaded inside of a PowerShell variable, I can use standard PowerShell semantics to query it. The second, and far simpler way, to compensate for the document fragment and the missing XML namespace association is to simply fold these items in as you load the XML content from disk. And I'll be honest with you, this is how most people end up doing it. In this example, I want to load the contents of my log.xml file produced by my demo application into PowerShell. The getContent commandlet pulls in the contents of log.xml, which I then surround with a pair of strings that defines a containing XML element. This element associates the Log4Net namespace with a dummy value. Once I've done this, I can query the document using standard PowerShell idioms. The XML layout is fantastic if you need a layout that provides a structured log. Unfortunately, the XML layout includes expensive logging properties, like the identity of the current user. And like the simple layout, the XML layout doesn't provide a configuration mechanism to disable these expensive properties.